If kindness had a scent, even the fiercest wolf would follow it home. Evelyn Carter woke with a start as the first pale streaks of dawn slipped through the snow-covered pines, and for one impossible heartbeat, she couldn't remember why her cheek rested against a mountain of warm silver and black fur. Her arms were wrapped around the enormous creature as though it were the safest thing in the forest, one hand buried deep in its thick coat while the fading campfire crackled beside them. The wolf never moved. It breathed in slow, steady rhythms that ruffled loose strands of her chestnut hair across her face. Her sleepy mind struggled to catch up with the strange picture before her. Then memory drifted back piece by piece. Only hours earlier, she had wandered far beyond the healer's trails after another long afternoon of gathering winter herbs no one else considered worth picking. Being in Omega meant she was rarely trusted with important work, and whenever the royal healers divided supplies after a battle, someone stronger always stepped ahead of her. She had learned not to argue. Quiet people survived by stepping around pride instead of through it. The snow had already begun falling when she noticed a trail of enormous paw prints pressing deep into the white ground. Every instinct warned her to turn back. Wolves that large belonged to legends whispered beside fireplaces, stories told to curious pups who refused to sleep. Yet something about the uneven pattern made her hesitate. The prints grew farther apart, then suddenly closer together, as though the animal had been struggling to stay on its feet. Curiosity tugged harder than fear. She followed the trail through towering pines until she found him lying beneath the bent branches of an ancient cedar, his massive body nearly hidden beneath fresh snow. Even curled against the frozen earth, he looked magnificent. His thick silver coat shimmered beneath the moonlight, darker streaks running along his shoulders like shadows painted into winter itself. His breathing was slow but steady, and though his size should have sent her running, all Evelyn saw was a lonely creature exhausted beyond measure. "Oh, you poor thing," she had whispered while kneeling carefully a few feet away. "Did you lose your family?" The giant wolf never opened his eyes. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't growl. He simply lay there as silent flakes settled across his fur. Evelyn glanced toward the dark woods surrounding them. If hunters discovered him before sunrise, panic alone might doom such a beautiful animal. She gathered fallen branches, coaxed a tiny fire to life with practiced hands, then returned carrying the only blanket she owned. It was far too small to cover him. She laughed softly at the hopeless attempt before spreading it over the broadest part of his side anyway. "You're much too big to be somebody's pup," she murmured with a tired smile. "But tonight, you'll have to pretend." Hours passed as the wind sharpened and the temperature fell. The fire shrank. Her fingers grew numb despite her gloves. At last, unable to ignore the cold any longer, Evelyn settled beside the great wolf, carefully leaning against the warmth radiating from his body. "Don't mind me," she whispered as her eyes drifted closed. "I'm borrowing your heat, and you can borrow mine." She never noticed the faint twitch beneath one silver ear. She never saw the golden eyes hidden behind heavy lids open for the briefest instant before quietly closing again. Evelyn drifted awake only when a tiny ember snapped inside the fire, sending a swirl of golden sparks into the crisp morning air. For a few peaceful seconds, she forgot she had spent the night deep inside forbidden forest lands. She only noticed the steady warmth against her shoulder and smiled sleepily before reaching up to scratch behind the giant wolf's ear. "Good morning," she whispered. "You made it through the night." The enormous creature remained perfectly still, breathing slowly as though wrapped inside the deepest sleep imaginable. Evelyn laughed softly to herself. "You really are the laziest pup I have ever met." Her fingers gently brushed snowflakes from the thick fur around his neck. The coat was softer than she had expected, impossibly clean beneath the frozen layer that had settled overnight. She wondered how such a magnificent animal could have ended up alone. Somewhere out there, she thought, another wolf must surely be searching for him. The idea made her heart ache. She understood loneliness far better than most people guessed. Since childhood, she had watched others chosen first for every celebration, every ceremony, every honor, while she quietly remained in the background carrying supplies or tending small wounds no one else wanted to treat. She had long ago stopped asking why. Some lives simply unfolded in silence. "Maybe that is why we found each other," she murmured. Two forgotten souls sharing one cold night. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the last piece of homemade oat bread she had packed before leaving the village. Breaking it in half, she smiled at the ridiculous thought crossing her mind. I know wolves probably do not eat this, but it feels rude not to offer breakfast. The wolf did not respond. She placed the bread beside the fire anyway before standing to stretch. The winter air bit at her cheeks as she collected fresh branches and coaxed the flames back to life. Every few moments she glanced toward her quiet companion, relieved each time she saw his chest rise and fall with calm, even breaths. She never noticed that beneath closed eyelids, sharp golden eyes were awake once again, carefully watching every movement she made before disappearing behind lowered lashes whenever she turned back toward him. Lucy and Ashford had survived battles that filled kingdoms with songs, endured storms that shattered fortress walls, and stared down enemies without a flicker of uncertainty. Yet nothing in all his years had prepared him for an Omega who tucked another blanket beneath his enormous paw because she worried the ground looked uncomfortable. He should have risen before dawn. He should have returned to his waiting guards, reclaimed his throne, and forgotten this strange encounter before the sun climbed higher. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, listening as Evelyn hummed a gentle tune while stirring pine needles away from the fire with a fallen branch. There was no fear in her voice. No greed, no ambition. She expected nothing in return for her kindness. That simple truth unsettled him more deeply than any challenge he had ever faced. As Evelyn settled beside him once more, resting her back lightly against his broad shoulder, she gazed through the towering pines where morning light painted silver across the snow. I hope your family finds you soon, she whispered with quiet sincerity. But if they are taking their time, you can stay with me a little longer. Hidden beneath his motionless expression, the Alpha King felt something unfamiliar quietly crack the frozen walls around his heart. The peaceful silence lasted until a pair of bright blue birds fluttered onto a nearby branch, filling the forest with cheerful songs that echoed between the towering pines. Evelyn smiled as she watched them hop from branch to branch. Even they know this is a beautiful morning, she whispered. You picked a wonderful place to rest. She leaned against the great wolf once more, absent-mindedly combing her fingers through the thick fur around his shoulder while enjoying the warmth that still lingered beneath his coat. Every now and then she paused to remove tiny twigs or melting snow from his magnificent mane, treating him with the same quiet care she had once shown abandoned farm animals back in her village. Hidden beneath closed eyes, Lucy and Ashford felt every gentle movement. His senses, far sharper than any ordinary wolf, caught the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the soft rustle of her clothes, and even the faint scent of lavender lingering on the wool scarf wrapped around her neck. It had been years since anyone had come this close without trembling. Whenever people approached the Alpha King, they carried admiration, fear, ambition, or hidden intentions. This Omega carried nothing except kindness. He had intended to remain unconscious only until sunrise. Then another minute had passed. Then another. Somehow the morning had slipped away while he listened to her talk about ordinary things. She spoke to him as though he truly were a lonely creature that had wandered too far from home. She wondered aloud whether wolves preferred rivers or mountains. She guessed he probably enjoyed chasing rabbits, even though one glance at his enormous size made that thought almost laughable. She apologized for talking too much, then continued anyway because, in her words, silence always felt less lonely when shared with someone. Lucian almost smiled. Almost. It took remarkable discipline not to betray himself when Evelyn gently rested her palm against the side of his face. You have kind eyes, she said softly, unaware those golden eyes remained hidden beneath carefully lowered lids. Even when they are closed, I think you are probably gentle. No one had ever used that word to describe him. Kings were called powerful. Commanders were called fearless. Legends called him unstoppable. Gentle had never belonged to his name. Somewhere beyond the trees, a distant raven called once before disappearing into the quiet morning. Lucian recognized the signal immediately. His royal scouts were searching nearby. They would be following his scent, spreading farther through the forest with every passing minute. If they found him now, everything would end. They would surround him with worried questions, escort him back to the capital, and this strange little moment would vanish like mist beneath sunlight. Yet he remained still. He wanted one more conversation, one more laugh, one more impossible moment where someone saw only a tired wolf instead of a king carrying the weight of an entire kingdom. Evelyn reached into her satchel again before letting out a disappointed sigh. Well, she admitted, that is everything I had left. She folded the empty cloth neatly and tucked it away. I should probably head back before everyone starts wondering where I disappeared to. She looked toward the forest path, then back at the giant wolf beside her. Her smile faded with quiet reluctance. But I do not really want to leave you alone. Those simple words settled deeper inside Lucien than any oath ever spoken before his throne. For the first time in many years, the Alpha King found himself wishing morning would slow down, because if she stayed only a little longer, he was no longer certain he wanted to keep pretending. The sound reached them long before anyone appeared. Hooves struck frozen ground in a steady rhythm, muffled by fresh snow yet unmistakable to ears that had learned the language of the forest. Evelyn lifted her head, listening carefully. Someone is coming, she whispered. Maybe they are looking for you. The giant wolf did not move. His breathing remained slow and even, every muscle perfectly relaxed beneath the thick silver coat. Only Lucien knew that every heartbeat drawing closer belonged to one of his own royal patrols. He recognized the cadence immediately. 4 horses, 6 riders traveling on foot beside them. They were spreading outward in careful formation, searching every valley and stream where their king might have crossed after the battle. Normally, he would have answered with a single commanding howl that carried for miles. Today he remained silent. Evelyn glanced nervously toward the narrow trail disappearing between the pines. If they are hunters, I will not let them frighten you. She spoke the promise so naturally that she seemed surprised by her own courage. Then she looked down at the enormous wolf and laughed softly. Although, honestly, you are much bigger than anything they could possibly hunt. She reached over and brushed another handful of snow from his shoulder before absent-mindedly straightening the little blanket that barely covered a fraction of his body. The gesture was so hopelessly unnecessary that Lucien nearly opened his eyes out of pure disbelief. No one had ever fussed over him before. They polished his armor. They prepared royal banquets. They bowed before his throne. But no one had ever worried whether he might be cold. A gentle breeze drifted through the cedar branches, carrying the scent of pine, melting ice, and wild rosemary hidden beneath the snow. Evelyn inhaled deeply. My grandmother always said the forest remembers every kind heart that walks beneath its trees. She smiled to herself. Maybe that is why I found you instead of someone cruel. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced small circles through the thick fur along his neck. The simple touch carried no expectation, no hesitation. It was comforting in the quiet way sunlight warmed an old cabin after a long winter night. Lucien realized something unsettling. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, he was not thinking about treaties, rival pacts, border disputes, or council meetings waiting for his return. He was listening to an Omega explain why squirrels always seemed happier after fresh snowfall. Somewhere beyond the trees, a familiar whistle echoed once, then twice. His captain, Rowan Mercer, never repeated that signal unless the situation had become urgent. The patrol was close now. Very close. Evelyn heard it too. Her expression changed as concern flickered across her face. That does not sound friendly. She rose carefully, dusting snow from her coat before stepping between the hidden trail and the resting wolf almost without thinking. She was not much taller than 5 feet 6 inches, and compared to the enormous creature behind her, she looked impossibly small. Yet she folded her hands together with quiet determination, already preparing herself to speak on behalf of someone who could not answer for himself. Lucien watched through barely open lashes, unseen behind lowered lids. Every instinct told him to stand, reveal himself, and spare her the trouble. Instead, he remained where he was because one impossible question had taken root inside his heart. If complete strangers appeared this very moment, would she still choose to protect the lonely wolf she believed needed her? As footsteps crunched through the snow only a few yards away, Evelyn drew one steady breath and refused to step aside. The first rider stepped through the curtain of snow-covered pines with remarkable caution, his dark green cloak dusted with frost and the silver crest of a howling wolf glinting against his shoulder. 5 more figures followed, spreading naturally across the clearing without a single wasted movement. Their eyes immediately settled on the enormous silver wolf resting beside the dying campfire. Every one of them froze. Rowan Mercer felt his pulse stumble. He had served beside Alpha King Lucian Ashford for more than 15 years. Yet seeing the legendary war wolf peacefully asleep beside a tiny Omega was beyond anything he had imagined possible. Even more astonishing was the sight of the young woman standing directly between them, arms stretched ever so slightly, as though she could somehow shield the giant creature behind her. Evelyn swallowed her nervousness before speaking. "Please," she said politely. "He is finally resting." The patrol exchanged confused glances. None of them answered immediately. Rowan slowly removed one glove, raising an open hand to show peaceful intentions. "Miss," he said gently, "that wolf does not belong in these woods." Evelyn frowned. "Belong?" She glanced over her shoulder at the sleeping animal before looking back at the strangers. "He belongs wherever he is safe." Another guard quietly cleared his throat. "You do not understand." "Maybe I do not," Evelyn admitted. "But he has been alone all night, and he has not hurt anyone." Her calm sincerity left the soldiers strangely speechless. They had expected fear, panic, perhaps even someone begging for rescue. Instead, they found an Omega defending the most feared wolf in the kingdom with nothing more than quiet conviction. Rowan took one careful step forward. "May we at least examine him?" Evelyn hesitated before gently shaking her head. "He needs sleep more than anything else." She looked down with genuine concern. "He has been breathing better since sunrise. If everyone crowds around him now, he might wake frightened." Several guards lowered their eyes, struggling to hide expressions that balanced somewhere between disbelief and amusement. "Frightened." The word almost made one young scout laugh before Rowan silenced him with a single warning glance. Hidden beneath perfectly relaxed eyelids, Lucian heard every sentence with growing difficulty because suppressing the urge to smile had become far harder than remaining motionless. No council member had ever denied his requests. No neighboring Alpha had dared question his authority. Yet this gentle Omega had calmly refused his entire royal patrol without raising her voice once. Rowan slowly studied the campfire, the folded blanket draped across Lucian's shoulder, the half loaf of bread resting on a nearby stone, and the scattered herbs drying beside the flames. The picture became painfully clear. She truly believed she was protecting an abandoned wolf. There was no scheme hiding beneath her kindness, no desire for reward, only compassion. He lowered his voice until only the nearest guards could hear. "No one disturbs him." Several soldiers looked at him in surprise. "Captain," one whispered. Rowan never took his eyes off Evelyn. "That is an order." The patrol quietly stepped backward, giving the clearing respectful distance. Evelyn released a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said with a grateful smile that caught every hardened warrior completely off guard. They had marched through storms, guarded castle walls, and escorted kings across dangerous borders. Yet somehow the simplest words spoken by an unknown Omega carried more warmth than the grandest praise they had ever received. As silence settled once again over the clearing, Rowan noticed something that made his heart skip. The tip of the great wolf's tail moved ever so slightly across the snow before becoming perfectly still again. He knew his king well enough to understand exactly what that tiny movement meant. Lucian Ashford was awake. He had heard every word, and for reasons no one present could yet explain, he had chosen not to open his eyes. The forest seemed to hold its breath as sunlight filtered through the towering pines, painting ribbons of gold across the untouched snow. No one dared disturb the strange peace that had settled over the clearing. Even the horses stood unusually quiet, their ears turned toward the enormous silver wolf as though they understood they were witnessing something they would tell stories about for years. Evelyn knelt beside her companion once more, relieved that the strangers had respected her request. She reached for a small wooden cup hanging from her satchel and walked to a nearby stream where crystal water slipped quietly beneath a thin sheet of ice. After filling the cup, she returned carefully, setting it beside the wolf's massive paw. "In case you are thirsty when you wake up," she whispered with a hopeful smile. "Although I suppose you probably drink much more than that." One of the younger guards lowered his head, pretending to inspect his saddle so she would not notice him smiling. Rowan Mercer folded his arms, hiding his own amusement. Never in all his years had he imagined someone placing a tiny cup of water beside the Alpha King's werewolf with complete sincerity. Yet somehow the simple gesture felt strangely appropriate. Lucien remained perfectly still. Every instinct urged him to rise now that his soldiers had arrived safely. His strength had already returned. His injuries had faded enough that shifting back into human form would no longer drain him. There was no practical reason to continue the performance. And still he lingered. He wanted to know whether kindness like Evelyn's could survive one final test. Would she stay if everyone around her silently questioned her choices? Or would embarrassment finally drive her away? Evelyn sat cross-legged beside him, brushing loose strands of chestnut hair behind her ear as she looked toward the peaceful stream. "You know," she said quietly, "people think Omegas are weak because we do not roar the loudest." She smiled faintly. "My grandmother used to tell me that warmth can carry farther than thunder if you give it enough time." Lucien listened without opening his eyes. Her words settled inside him with surprising weight. Since inheriting the throne, every lesson he had learned spoke of strength, strategy, authority, and sacrifice. No one had ever suggested that gentleness could change a kingdom. Rowan studied his king carefully. The barely noticeable rise and fall of Lucien's breathing had shifted. It was steadier now, calmer than it had been since the patrol first discovered him. The captain suddenly understood what he was witnessing. The Alpha King was not simply resting. For the first time in years, he was truly at peace. A soft breeze carried the scent of evergreen through the clearing. Evelyn reached over one last time and gently straightened the blanket that had slipped from the wolf's shoulder. "There," she murmured. "Much better." She rested her hand lightly against the thick silver fur for only a moment before beginning to gather her satchel. "I really should leave now. My village will worry if I stay much longer." Her voice remained cheerful, but disappointment quietly slipped into the final words. "I just hope you remember that someone believed you would be all right." As she slowly rose to her feet and turned toward the forest path, Lucien felt something inside him resist the idea of letting her walk away. The distance between them was only a few steps, yet it suddenly felt greater than any kingdom he had ever ruled. Hidden beneath closed eyelids, the Alpha King made his decision. He would not allow this farewell to become the end of their story. One step. That was all Evelyn managed before a sound behind her brought the entire forest to a standstill. It was not a growl or a howl. It was the slow, steady exhale of a great wolf finally choosing to wake. She turned instinctively, her blue eyes widening as the enormous silver creature lifted his head for the first time since she had found him beneath the ancient cedar. Golden eyes, brighter than the morning sun reflecting across fresh snow, met hers with calm intelligence. They were not the eyes of a frightened animal. They were the eyes of someone who had understood every word she had spoken since the previous night. Evelyn stood frozen. You are awake." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The wolf regarded her quietly, his gaze gentle, almost curious, before slowly rising onto powerful legs. The blanket she had tucked around him slipped onto the snow. For a brief moment the clearing fell completely silent. Even the birds stopped singing. Then silver light shimmered softly through the winter air, wrapping around the great wolf like drifting moonlight. It was neither frightening nor violent. It flowed peacefully across his fur as though the morning itself had decided to embrace him. Evelyn instinctively took half a step backward, unable to understand what she was seeing. The silver glow grew brighter for only a heartbeat before fading into the crisp mountain air. Where the great wolf had stood now stood a tall man with snow-white hair brushing the collar of a dark travel cloak that seemed to appear with the fading light. His posture was calm, his expression composed, and his striking golden eyes remained exactly the same as the ones that had watched her through nearly 2 days of quiet conversation. Evelyn stared in speechless disbelief. Her mind refused to connect the gentle wolf she had comforted with the man, now standing only a few feet away. Before she could find a single word, every member of the royal patrol moved at once. Helmets lowered, hands crossed respectfully over their hearts. Rowan Mercer stepped forward and bowed his head deeply. "Your Majesty." The other guards immediately followed. "Your Majesty." Their voices blended together across the clearing with perfect discipline. Evelyn looked from the kneeling soldiers to the tall stranger, then back again. Her breath caught. The stories told around village fireplaces rushed through her memory all at once. the fearless ruler of the Northern Territories. The king whose wolf was said to be larger than any living legend. The alpha whose name alone settled disputes before they even began. She slowly raised one trembling hand toward her mouth. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as though reality might change if she refused to believe it. "That cannot be." Lucian Ashford met her stunned gaze with quiet warmth instead of royal distance. There was no trace of mockery in his expression, only gratitude. "It can," he answered softly, his voice calm and rich like distant thunder softened by falling snow. Evelyn's cheeks immediately flushed with embarrassment as dozens of memories raced through her mind at once. She had scratched behind his ear. She had called him a lazy pup. She had shared her last piece of bread with the Alpha King. She had even tucked a blanket over the ruler of the kingdom because she thought he looked cold. She wished the snow beneath her feet would somehow open and hide her forever. Yet before she could apologize, Lucian surprised everyone present by taking one slow step toward her with the same peaceful expression he had worn while listening to her gentle voice beside the campfire. And for the first time in many years, every soldier watching their king realized they were not looking at the Alpha who ruled an empire. They were looking at a man whose heart had quietly awakened long before he ever opened his eyes. No one spoke. The silence stretching across the clearing carried more weight than any royal proclamation ever could. Snow drifted lazily through the branches, settling upon the forgotten blanket still lying between Evelyn and Lucian, as though even winter itself refused to interrupt the moment. Evelyn lowered her gaze almost immediately, unable to meet the Alpha King's eyes for more than a heartbeat. "Your Majesty," she managed softly, her voice filled with embarrassment rather than fear. I did not know." She clasped her hands together, replaying every conversation she had shared beside the campfire. Every cheerful story, every gentle pat behind his ear, every time she had called him a good boy or worried that he had skipped breakfast. Heat rushed into her cheeks. "Please forgive me if I behaved improperly." Lucian looked at her for a long moment before a faint smile finally reached his eyes. "If you had known who I was," he answered calmly, "you would never have spoken to me that way." Evelyn blinked in surprise. "Probably not," she admitted honestly. "Exactly." His quiet answer left everyone listening unusually still. Rowan Mercer glanced toward the other guards, recognizing the expression on his king's face. Lucian was speaking not as a ruler protecting his dignity, but as a man protecting something unexpectedly precious. The Alpha King slowly bent to retrieve the small wool blanket Evelyn had tucked around him only minutes before. Snow clung to its worn edges, and one corner had been carefully mended several times with blue thread. It was clearly old, clearly valuable to its owner despite its simplicity. Lucian gently brushed away the snow before folding it with surprising care. Then he stepped closer and offered it back to her with both hands. "Thank you," he said sincerely. Evelyn accepted it almost automatically, still too overwhelmed to fully understand what was happening. "It was only a blanket," she murmured. Lucian slowly shook his head. "It was the only blanket you had." Those words settled over the clearing more deeply than anyone expected. The younger guards quietly lowered their eyes. They had seen noble families offer expensive gifts to gain favor with the crown, yet none of those grand gestures carried the quiet honesty of one Omega, sharing her only source of warmth with someone she believed needed it more. Lucian turned slightly toward his patrol. His voice remained calm, yet it carried the unmistakable authority of a king. "You all witnessed what happened here." Every soldier immediately straightened. "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked back at Evelyn before continuing. "This woman believed I was nothing more than a lost wolf. She expected no reward. She asked no questions. She sought no recognition." His golden eyes swept across every member of the patrol. "Remember that." Rowan bowed his head respectfully. "We will, Your Majesty." Evelyn shifted uneasily beneath the unexpected attention. "I truly did not do anything special," she insisted. "Anyone would have helped." Several guards exchanged silent glances, knowing that was simply not true. They had ridden through villages where frightened people locked their doors at the first distant howl. Yet this quiet Omega had chosen compassion before caution. Lucian's gaze softened once again. "You believe everyone would have stayed." His voice became almost gentle. "I know they would not have." Evelyn finally looked into his eyes without flinching. For the first time since learning his identity, she saw beyond the title, beyond the legends, and recognized the same lonely soul she had spoken to beside the fire. The only difference was that now she understood why those golden eyes had seemed so impossibly wise from the very beginning. The journey back toward the capital began beneath a sky so clear that every snow-covered peak seemed close enough to touch. Evelyn walked quietly beside Lucien, still holding the carefully folded blanket against her chest, as though the familiar piece of wool anchored her in a reality that had suddenly become almost unbelievable. The Royal Patrol followed several yards behind, giving the two of them respectful space. No one wished to interrupt the silence. It no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. As they reached the edge of the forest, Lucien slowed his steps and looked back toward the ancient cedar where fate had quietly rewritten the course of both their lives. "Do you know why I remained asleep?" he asked gently. Evelyn looked up, curiosity replacing some of her lingering embarrassment. "I thought you were too exhausted to wake." A faint smile appeared on his face. "I woke long before sunrise." She stopped walking. "You what?" The realization spread across her expression, one memory at a time. Every story she had told, every silly question she had asked, every time she had brushed snow from his fur or reminded him to stay warm. "You heard everything?" she asked, covering her face with one hand. Lucien nodded once. "Every word." Evelyn let out a quiet groan. "That is even more embarrassing." To her surprise, Lucien laughed softly. It was a warm, genuine sound that caused every member of the Royal Patrol to glance toward him in stunned silence. Rowan Mercer had heard the Alpha King address councils, armies, and neighboring rulers, yet he could not remember the last time he had heard him laugh so freely. Lucien turned toward Evelyn again, his golden eyes brighter than the winter morning. "Those conversations were the most honest anyone has shared with me in many years." She lowered her hand slowly. "I only spoke that way because I believed you were a lonely wolf." "Exactly," he replied. "You spoke to me without fear, without expectation, and without caring about my title." They resumed walking together, their footsteps leaving two quiet trails through untouched snow. Before long, the towering gates of the capital appeared in the distance, rising proudly above the valley. Guards upon the walls noticed the returning patrol and quickly opened the massive entrance. Citizens gathering near the marketplace paused as the Alpha King entered, but their attention soon shifted toward the unfamiliar young Omega walking calmly beside him. Curious whispers drifted gently through the streets, yet Lucien paid them no attention. Instead, he removed the heavy royal cloak resting across his shoulders and placed it around Evelyn before she could object. "The mountain wind is colder here," he said simply. She instinctively reached for the edges of the cloak, surprised by its comforting warmth. "Your Majesty, I cannot possibly." "You already shared your warmth with me," Lucien interrupted kindly. "Allow me to return the favor." Evelyn looked at him in quiet disbelief before offering the same gentle smile that had greeted a lonely wolf beside a fading campfire. It was small, sincere, and completely unchanged. In that moment, Lucien understood something every victory, every crown, and every title had failed to teach him. True strength was never measured by how many people feared you. It was measured by how safe someone felt standing beside you. High above the palace, the winter breeze carried away the last traces of fresh snow, while beneath the open sky the Alpha King silently thanked fate for one sleepy Omega who had mistaken a weary king for a lonely creature in need of nothing more than kindness.